I warned the fake HOA patrol to leave. They refused and picked the wrong landowner. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small request. Please let me know where you are tuning in from today. Leave the name of your city or country in the comments section below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main character of the story. You have exactly one chance to walk back to your truck, I told the woman standing in my driveway, because the next step you take is going to cost you a lot more than you think. She smiled like she had heard that line 100 times before. The three people behind her chuckled, adjusting the bright yellow safety vests that read HOA Patrol across the back in bold black letters. Their white SUV sat beside my mailbox with amber lights flashing as if they represented some official authority. To anyone driving by, they looked convincing. That was exactly what made them dangerous. My name is Ethan Walker, and until that Tuesday morning, I thought I had seen every kind of HOA overreach imaginable. I dealt with warning letters, ridiculous complaints about my mailbox color, and even anonymous reports claiming my pickup truck had been parked an inch too close to the curb. But nothing prepared me for the moment a group calling themselves the HOA Patrol crossed my property line and ordered me to leave my own land. The morning had started quietly. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted across my 5-acre property while coffee steamed in my favorite mug. A pair of bluebirds hopped across the split-rail fence I'd spent 2 weekends Everything about the morning felt ordinary until I heard tires crunching across my gravel driveway. I looked up expecting a delivery truck. Instead, a white SUV rolled slowly toward my barn without stopping at the gate. It wasn't just the vehicle that caught my attention. It was the confidence. Whoever they were, they drove like they believed every inch of my property already belonged to them. The driver's door swung open before the engine even stopped. A woman in her early 50s stepped out carrying a clipboard thick with papers. Her sunglasses hid most of her expression, but her posture said everything. She wasn't here to ask questions. She was here to issue orders. "Are you Ethan Walker?" she asked without introducing herself. "Depends who's asking," I answered. She ignored the question. "This property is currently under HOA enforcement review. You'll need to vacate this section immediately while our inspection team documents multiple violations." I stared at her for several seconds, honestly wondering if I had misheard. "Excuse me." She flipped a page on her clipboard. "Failure to cooperate may result in additional penalties." Behind her, the other three climbed out carrying cameras, orange traffic cones, and what looked like temporary warning signs. One of them headed straight toward my fence as if he intended to post something on it. That's when I spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Nobody takes another step." They stopped for only a second before continuing as though I hadn't said anything. "You're trespassing," I repeated. The woman finally looked directly at me. "Actually," she replied with a practiced smile, "you're interfering with an authorized HOA inspection." Those words told me almost everything I needed to know. Almost. I glanced toward the entrance of my property where a small crowd of neighbors had already started slowing their cars to watch. Some recognized the SUV. Others simply assumed anyone wearing matching uniforms must have legitimate authority. Perception spreads faster than facts in neighborhoods like ours. The woman extended a folded document toward me without ever crossing the last few feet between us. "Sign this acknowledgement of violation." I didn't even reach for it. Instead, I noticed something much more interesting. The logo printed across the top looked close enough to seem official at first glance, but not close enough to fool someone who had actually read our governing documents. One missing word, one incorrect seal, one expensive mistake. I looked back at her and smiled for the first time that morning. "I'm going to warn you one more time," I said calmly. "Take your people, your signs, and your fake authority back to that SUV and leave my property." She folded her arms and shook her head. "Mr. Walker," she said confidently, "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with." I slipped my phone into my shirt pocket with the camera already recording, glanced once toward the security camera mounted beneath my porch roof, and realized they had just picked the wrong landowner. I did not raise my voice again because I had already learned one lesson about people who wear fake authority like a uniform. The louder they become, the quieter you should be. Brenda Collins looked over her shoulder and gave a quick nod. The three people with her immediately spread across my front yard as though they had rehearsed the routine dozens of times before. One unfolded a bright orange warning sign that read property under HOA enforcement. Another started placing traffic cones along the edge of my gravel driveway. The third lifted a tablet and slowly filmed my house from left to right, making sure to capture every angle. They wanted anyone watching to believe this was an official operation. I stood on my porch with my coffee still warm in my hand, watching every movement without interrupting. Brenda glanced back at me and smiled. "Now you are cooperating," she said. "That is a smart decision." "No," I answered calmly. "I am observing." She laughed softly as if I had made a joke. "You can observe all you want. This inspection is happening whether you agree or not." By then, two of my neighbors had already walked closer to the property line. Mr. Dawson from across the road leaned against his mailbox with folded arms. A young couple walking their golden retriever slowed down to watch. Another truck stopped on the shoulder for a better view. It amazed me how quickly a crowd could form whenever someone appeared to be enforcing rules. Most people never questioned whether those rules actually existed. They simply assumed the person holding the clipboard must be right. Brenda seemed to enjoy the audience. She raised her clipboard high enough for everyone to see and spoke louder than necessary. "This homeowner has accumulated multiple violations and has refused to cooperate with the association." I noticed several neighbors exchange uncomfortable looks. I knew exactly what they were thinking. If Ethan was arguing with the HOA, maybe he had finally crossed the line. Reputation can shift in seconds when someone speaks confidently enough. One member of the fake patrol walked directly toward my split-rail fence and attached a laminated notice with a zip tie. He did not ask permission. He simply acted as though permission was unnecessary. I slowly walked over and looked at the document without touching it. The paper listed fines, inspection fees, administrative penalties, and possible legal action. Every sentence sounded official. Every paragraph was designed to intimidate. But the formatting was inconsistent, several legal references were outdated, and the return address belonged to a private mailbox nearly 40 miles away. Whoever created it understood psychology much better than property law. Brenda noticed me studying the page. "You should probably read the last section," she said confidently. "Failure to comply could eventually affect your ownership rights." I looked at her for a moment before answering. "Do you actually believe that?" She hesitated for the first time since arriving. Only for a second, but I caught it. "That is not really your concern." "Actually," I replied, "it is exactly my concern." One of her teammates interrupted by calling out, "We found another violation near the barn." Brenda nodded dramatically and made another note on her clipboard without even walking over to verify what he claimed to have found. That told me everything. They were documenting conclusions instead of facts. The inspection had already been decided before they ever entered my driveway. As she continued writing, I quietly reached into my pocket and opened another application on my phone. The timestamp, location data, and continuous recording activated without making a sound. My porch camera had already been recording since sunrise, but I preferred having multiple angles whenever strangers entered private property. Redundancy had saved me before. It would probably save me again. Brenda stepped closer until she stood only a few feet away. "This can all go away today," she said in a friendlier tone. "Just acknowledge the violations, cooperate with the inspection, and everything becomes much easier." I almost smiled. There it was. The pressure had changed into persuasion. They wanted compliance more than confrontation. That usually meant they needed my cooperation to make their paperwork appear legitimate. I folded my arms and looked directly into her sunglasses. "I have one question," I said. "Before you answer, think carefully because every camera on this property is recording." She maintained her confident posture, but the smile became noticeably smaller. "Go ahead," I asked. "Which legally registered homeowners association sent you here today?" For the first time since their SUV rolled into my driveway, nobody answered immediately. I let the silence linger because silence has a way of exposing people who are pretending to know more than they actually do. Brenda looked toward the man holding the tablet, then back at me. "The association has authorized us," she finally answered. "That is all you need to know." I nodded slowly. That was not my question. She cleared her throat and glanced toward the growing crowd gathering near the edge of my property. More vehicles had pulled over. A delivery driver paused at the entrance to my driveway. Even the mail carrier remained parked a short distance away, watching everything unfold through the windshield. In a neighborhood like ours, unusual events spread faster than weather reports. Brenda understood she was performing now, and performances depend on confidence. We do not have to explain internal administrative matters to homeowners, she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. Our authority comes directly from the governing board. Several people in the crowd nodded as though that sounded perfectly reasonable. I recognized many of them. Some had lived here for years, while others had moved in recently and naturally assumed anyone carrying official-looking paperwork must represent the community. That assumption was exactly what these people depended on. I slowly walked toward my mailbox, stopping beside the white SUV. From a distance, the decals looked convincing. Blue lettering, reflective stripes, a gold emblem on both front doors. But standing only a few feet away revealed details that would never survive close inspection. The lettering had tiny air bubbles trapped beneath the vinyl. One corner of the emblem had already started peeling away in the summer heat. The license plate frame advertised a printing company nearly 2 counties away. This vehicle had not been issued by any organization. It had been decorated to create an illusion. Brenda noticed where I was looking and casually stepped between me and the driver's door. "Please do not interfere with official equipment," she said. I smiled politely. Official equipment usually comes with official registration. Her expression tightened for just a moment before she turned back toward the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called out, "we are simply trying to protect community standards." That sentence changed the mood immediately. Community standards. It sounded responsible. It sounded familiar. It sounded like something people wanted to support without asking too many questions. One of my neighbors, Mrs. Keller, folded her arms and looked at me with visible disappointment. "Ethan," she said, "why are you making this harder than it has to be?" I looked at her and answered calmly, "Because sometimes the easiest thing to do is also the most dangerous." She frowned, clearly not understanding. I could not blame her. She had only been watching for a few minutes. She had not noticed the inconsistencies, the rehearsed phrases, or the carefully staged routine. Brenda stepped closer again, lowering her voice. "You are embarrassing yourself." "No," I replied. "Someone is embarrassing themselves. We just have not reached that part yet." She laughed, but it sounded forced this time. Her confidence was beginning to crack beneath the weight of simple questions she could not answer. Meanwhile, her team continued pretending to conduct inspections. The man with the tablet slowly circled my barn without ever measuring anything. Another photographed my fence from different angles but ignored the property markers installed by the county surveyor only 6 months earlier. The third continued attaching notices wherever he thought they would attract the most attention. None of them examined facts. They documented appearances. I quietly opened the weatherproof box mounted beside my mailbox and removed a folded property survey that I kept there for contractors and utility crews. I unfolded it carefully, studying the familiar boundary lines while saying nothing. Brenda glanced at the document and dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "Private paperwork does not override association enforcement." "You are absolutely right," I answered. "Private paperwork does not. County records do." I folded the survey again and slipped it back into the box without showing it to her. There was no reason to reveal my hand too early. Every unnecessary argument would only distract from the evidence already building around us. My security cameras had captured every arrival, every step beyond the property line, every notice attached to my fence, and every statement Brenda had made. Even better, several neighbors had started recording on their own phones, believing they were documenting a stubborn homeowner refusing to cooperate. They did not realize their videos were preserving something much more valuable. They were creating independent witnesses. As Brenda gathered her team near the front of the house, I overheard one of them whisper quietly, "Should we call the office?" She answered just softly enough that she probably thought nobody else could hear. "Not yet. We can finish this before anyone starts checking." The moment those words reached my ears, I knew this had never been about enforcing rules. It had always been about staying one step ahead of the truth. The whisper confirmed what my instincts had been telling me since the white SUV rolled onto my property. They were not worried about whether they were right. They were worried about whether someone else might discover they were wrong. I kept my expression calm because people reveal far more when they believe they are still in control. Brenda turned back toward me with her clipboard tucked under one arm as though nothing unusual had happened. "Mr. Walker," she said, "this is your final opportunity to cooperate before additional actions become necessary." I looked around at my front yard. The orange cones, the warning notices, the staged inspection, and the growing audience all created the appearance of authority. Appearance was their strongest weapon. Facts were mine. Before you take another step, I said, would you mind answering one simple question for everyone standing here? She folded her arms. I already told you we do not have to explain internal procedures. I am not asking about procedures, I replied. I am asking about identity. A few neighbors moved closer, curious enough to hear the conversation. Even the delivery driver remained parked near the entrance instead of continuing his route. Brenda forced another confident smile. Go ahead. Please tell everyone the legal name of the homeowners association that supposedly authorized today's inspection. Her smile faded just enough for me to notice. She glanced at the papers on her clipboard before answering. The Community Association. Which one? I asked. This community has a registered legal name. What is it? She paused for 2 full seconds before replying. That information is included in our records. Then it should be easy to say out loud. Nobody spoke. Even the birds that had been chirping near the fence seemed to disappear into the trees. Brenda finally changed the subject instead of answering. You are attempting to delay an official inspection. I nodded slowly. Thank you. She frowned. For what? For answering a different question than the one I asked. A few people in the crowd exchanged uncertain looks. The confidence that had filled the front yard 15 minutes earlier was beginning to thin. Doubt had entered the conversation, and doubt is difficult to remove once it appears. Brenda motioned for one of her teammates to continue photographing the property. He lifted his tablet toward my detached garage, but I noticed he deliberately avoided recording the county-issued address marker mounted beside the garage door. That marker had been installed after the property survey was updated the previous year. It was impossible to miss unless someone wanted to ignore it. I quietly walked toward the marker and stood beside it without saying a word. The man lowered the tablet and turned away. Another small detail. Another piece of the puzzle. My phone vibrated gently inside my pocket. Without attracting attention, I glanced at the screen. Every security camera around the property was functioning normally. The recordings had already been automatically backed up to cloud storage. Timestamps, audio, video, and motion logs were safely preserved. Even if something unexpected happened next, nothing that had already occurred could be erased. That knowledge allowed me to remain completely relaxed. Brenda noticed my calm expression and seemed almost frustrated by it. Most homeowners understand the importance of cooperation, she said. Most inspectors understand the importance of lawful authority, I answered. She ignored the remark and flipped through another stack of papers. We also have reports from concerned neighbors. I looked around the crowd. Interesting. Would any of those neighbors like to identify themselves? No one spoke. Several people quietly looked at one another. Mrs. Keller lowered her eyes. Mr. Dawson scratched his chin thoughtfully. The silence said more than any accusation ever could. Brenda immediately redirected the conversation. Confidential complaints are protected. Of course they are, I replied. Real complaints submitted to real organizations usually are. Her jaw tightened. She realized I was no longer debating the alleged violations. I was examining the legitimacy of every claim she made. Those were 2 completely different conversations, and only one of them could survive scrutiny. Then something unexpected happened. A silver pickup truck slowed near the entrance to my driveway. The driver looked at the white SUV, the cones, the warning signs, and then at me. He did not stop completely. Instead, he took out his phone, snapped a few pictures from the road, and drove away. Brenda barely noticed him. I did. Around here, people who work with county offices often drove unmarked vehicles exactly like that. Whether he was simply passing by or recognized something unusual, I could not be certain. But I had learned long ago that truth has an interesting habit of attracting the right witnesses at exactly the right moment. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, took a slow breath, and realized I no longer needed to prove these people were pretending. All I needed to do was give them enough time to prove it themselves. The longer Brenda stayed on my property, the more she seemed determined to act as though confidence alone could replace legitimacy. I had seen that pattern before. People who truly possess authority rarely need to announce it every few minutes. They simply present the facts and allow the law to speak for itself. Brenda, on the other hand, seemed to believe every conversation required another performance. She took one deliberate step toward the center of my driveway and raised her clipboard again. This inspection is now officially documented. she declared loudly enough for every neighbor to hear. Continued refusal to cooperate will be included in our final report. I nodded once. Good, I answered. Please make sure the report includes the exact time your vehicle entered private property without permission. She frowned as though she had not expected that response. One of her teammates quietly whispered something, but she waved him off without listening. They had invested too much effort into the appearance of control to back away now. I looked across my yard toward the weatherproof survey box mounted beside the mailbox. Inside it was more than a simple property map. Along with the certified county survey, I kept copies of the recorded deed, easement documents, and contact information for every agency that had jurisdiction over this land. Years earlier, after purchasing the property, I promised myself I would never argue about ownership from memory. If anyone questioned my rights, I would answer with documentation instead of emotion. That habit had seemed excessive at the time. Standing there that morning, it suddenly felt invaluable. I reached into my pocket and unlocked my phone again. This time I did not open the camera. Instead, I selected a contact I had fortunately never needed to call before. The number belonged to the County Property Records and Compliance Office. They handled boundary verification, recorded ownership disputes, and reports involving unauthorized representations connected to property enforcement. I stepped a few feet away, allowing everyone to see that I was making the call instead of hiding it. Brenda watched carefully, trying to appear unconcerned, but I noticed her fingers tighten around the edge of the clipboard. After 2 rings, a calm voice answered. I introduced myself, provided my parcel number from memory, and briefly explained that individuals claiming to represent a homeowners association were conducting enforcement activities on my property while refusing to identify the legally registered association they claimed to serve. The representative listened without interrupting. Then she asked several precise questions. Did they present government identification? No. Did they provide documentation identifying the registered association? No. Had they entered private property? Yes. Were they still on site? Yes. She thanked me and requested that I remain where I was while preserving all recordings and documents. She also asked me not to engage in further arguments because accurate documentation would be more valuable than confrontation. That advice matched exactly what I had already planned to do. When I ended the call, Brenda immediately asked, "Finished calling your lawyer?" I smiled politely. "No." "The sheriff?" she guessed. "No." "Then who?" she demanded. "Someone who keeps official property records," I replied. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. It was not panic. Not yet. It was uncertainty. For the first time that morning, she no longer seemed completely sure of the script. She glanced toward the man with the tablet, who quietly lowered it instead of continuing to record. Another teammate checked his phone twice in less than 10 seconds. Their confidence was beginning to fracture, not because I had threatened them, but because they suddenly realized someone else might soon verify every statement they had made. Around us, the atmosphere shifted as well. The neighbors who had originally watched with curiosity were now listening much more carefully. Mr. Dawson walked closer and politely asked Brenda, "Which homeowners association are you representing?" She answered with the same vague explanation about administrative procedures. This time nobody seemed satisfied. Mrs. Keller looked toward me instead of Brenda. "Ethan," she asked carefully, "have you really never received any official notice before today?" "Not from any legitimate association," I answered truthfully. She slowly nodded, her earlier confidence fading into visible concern. The questions were no longer coming only from me. They were spreading naturally through the crowd, and every unanswered question weakened the illusion these visitors had worked so hard to create. Then my phone vibrated again. A brief message appeared across the screen from the county representative I had just spoken with. It simply read, "Verification request received. Please remain on site. Appropriate personnel are reviewing the reported information." I locked the screen without showing anyone. I did not need to announce what was happening. The process had already begun, and unlike staged inspections or impressive uniforms, real authority never needed an audience to prove it existed. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and took another slow sip of coffee. It had gone cold nearly an hour earlier, but I barely noticed. My attention stayed on Brenda and the 3 people standing around her. They had arrived with the confidence of professionals carrying out a routine inspection. Now they were quietly looking at one another, waiting for someone else to make the next decision. Confidence disappears quickly when it has no legal foundation beneath it. Brenda broke the silence first. "We are not required to wait here all day," she announced. "Our findings have already been documented." "Then leaving should be easy," I replied. "You have been free to leave since the moment you arrived." She ignored that comment and turned toward the man holding the tablet. "Finish the photographs," she instructed. He looked uncertain. "Do we really need more?" he asked quietly. "Just finish." Instead of walking toward my house, he slowly approached the split-rail fence where one of the laminated violation notices still hung from the wooden post. As he reached for another photograph, Mr. Dawson spoke from behind the crowd. "Would you mind taking a picture of the county survey marker too?" The man froze for a second before pretending not to hear the question. Mrs. Keller looked toward the marker beside my garage and then back at Brenda. "Actually," she said, "I would like to know why nobody has looked at those markers all morning." Brenda answered immediately. "They are not relevant to this inspection." I smiled because that response was more revealing than she realized. Property boundaries are always relevant during a legitimate property enforcement action. Ignoring them made no sense unless acknowledging them would undermine the entire operation. Another neighbor, Tom Richards, stepped forward holding his own phone. "Can I ask something?" Brenda nodded reluctantly. "Sure. What company employs your inspection team?" She hesitated. "We are contracted through the association." "What is the company's name?" Tom continued. Once again, there was no direct answer. I watched the crowd carefully. The expressions had completely changed. Earlier that morning, they had watched me with skepticism. Now they were examining every answer Brenda gave. The burden had quietly shifted. I no longer needed to convince anyone that something was wrong. Brenda needed to convince everyone that something was right. Her team sensed it too. The woman placing the orange cones began collecting 2 of them without being asked. Another quietly removed one of the laminated notices from my fence and tucked it beneath his arm. Brenda immediately noticed. "Leave everything where it is," she ordered. He looked uncomfortable. "I thought we were wrapping up." "We are not finished." "Are you sure?" he asked. It was a simple question, but hearing one member of her own group question her judgment changed the atmosphere even further. Brenda looked irritated. "Yes, I am sure." My phone vibrated once again. This time it was another message from the county office. It informed me that ownership records had already been verified and that the parcel number I provided matched the recorded deed exactly. They also confirmed something I already suspected. According to the county database, no homeowners association with enforcement authority was registered over my property or the surrounding acreage. I did not need to show the message to anyone. I simply smiled and locked the screen. Brenda noticed anyway. "You seem very confident," she said. "Confidence comes from facts," I answered, "not uniforms." Before she could respond, another vehicle entered the road leading toward my driveway. It was the same silver pickup truck I had noticed earlier. This time it slowed to a complete stop near the entrance instead of continuing down the road. A man wearing a plain button-down shirt stepped out carrying nothing more dramatic than a thin folder. There were no flashing lights, no large decals, no dramatic entrance. He simply looked around the property with quiet attention before walking toward us at an unhurried pace. Brenda watched him carefully. "Can I help you?" she called. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me first. "Mr. Ethan Walker?" "Yes." He nodded. "Thank you for remaining on site." Only then did he turn toward Brenda. "Good morning. My name is Daniel Foster." He opened the folder just enough to display an official county identification card before closing it again. There was no theatrical gesture, no attempt to impress anyone. The card was shown only long enough for the people who needed to see it. The contrast between him and the so-called HOA patrol could not have been greater. Daniel calmly looked around at the warning signs, the cones, the clipboard, and the SUV before asking one simple question in an even voice. "Would someone please identify the legally registered organization that authorized this enforcement activity today?" For the 3rd time that morning, the entire front yard fell completely silent. Daniel Foster did not raise his voice or repeat the question. He simply stood with one hand resting on the thin folder he carried and waited. The silence lasted several long seconds before Brenda finally answered. "We represent the Community Association." Daniel nodded politely. "Please provide the registered legal name." Brenda glanced toward her team. "The Homeowners Association for this neighborhood." "That is not a legal name," Daniel replied in the same calm tone. Every registered association has an official name recorded with the county. Which organization are you representing today? I noticed the man with the tablet slowly lower it until it rested against his leg. The woman who had been arranging traffic cones quietly stepped backward toward the white SUV. Nobody looked confident anymore. Brenda cleared her throat. We do not carry those records during field inspections. Daniel opened his folder and removed a single sheet of paper. That is understandable. Fortunately, I do. He held the page where everyone nearby could see it without making a dramatic display. The parcel owned by Ethan Walker is correctly recorded in the county property system. There is no registered homeowners association with enforcement authority over this parcel. The words spread through the crowd almost instantly. I heard someone quietly whisper, "There is no association?" Another neighbor repeated the sentence to someone standing farther back. Suddenly, every conversation shifted away from me and toward Brenda. Daniel continued speaking without changing his tone. Mr. Walker contacted our office requesting verification after individuals identifying themselves as property enforcement representatives entered private property. We verified the ownership records before arriving. Brenda folded her arms. There must be outdated information in your system. Daniel looked down at the document for a brief moment before meeting her eyes again. The records were confirmed less than 20 minutes ago using the recorded deed and current parcel database. She immediately tried another explanation. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody argued. His words were simple, factual, and impossible to misunderstand. He turned toward the white SUV. Who owns the vehicle displaying the enforcement markings? Brenda answered. It belongs to our organization. Which organization? Daniel asked again. Once more, there was no answer. I watched several neighbors exchange uneasy looks. Mrs. Keller slowly walked closer to one of the laminated notices hanging from my fence and read it more carefully than she had earlier. This address is a private mailbox, she said quietly. Tom Richards stepped beside her. And this phone number only goes to voicemail. The illusion was unraveling piece by piece, not because anyone accused Brenda of wrongdoing, but because ordinary people had finally started examining the details instead of the appearance. Daniel turned another page inside his folder. Mr. Walker also informed our office that inspection notices were attached to his property and that statements regarding ownership consequences were made during this encounter. Brenda immediately responded. We were simply informing the homeowner of possible administrative actions. Daniel asked, administrative actions authorized by whom? Again, there was no response. The man with the tablet finally spoke for the first time in several minutes. Brenda, maybe we should just leave. She looked at him sharply. Not yet. He shook his head. This is not what we were told. The woman collecting the cones quietly added, I thought this neighborhood actually had an association. Brenda looked from one teammate to another, realizing the certainty she had projected all morning had disappeared. She was no longer trying to persuade skeptical homeowners. She was trying to hold together her own group. Daniel remained composed. Nobody here is preventing anyone from leaving, he said. However, before you do, I recommend removing every notice placed on private property and avoiding any further statements suggesting official enforcement authority until your organization's status can be properly verified. It was not a threat. It was not an order delivered with anger. It was calm, practical guidance supported by verified records. Brenda looked around the yard one last time. The neighbors who had once watched me with suspicion were now looking directly at her. Several phones were still recording. Every orange cone, every laminated notice, every confident statement from earlier that morning had become part of the story they had created themselves. I thought back to the first warning I had given when they stepped onto my driveway. I had told them they had one chance to leave. They had mistaken patience for weakness. Now every decision they had made since crossing my property line had become evidence that no amount of matching uniforms or confident speeches could imitate the quiet strength of the truth. Brenda stood motionless for several seconds, looking at the folder in Daniel Foster's hands as though the official records might somehow change if she waited long enough. They did not. Facts have a remarkable quality. They remain exactly what they are, whether someone accepts them or not. Finally, she let out a slow breath and turned toward her team. Take the notices down, she said quietly. There was no confidence left in her voice. The man with the tablet immediately walked to my fence and carefully removed the laminated warning that he had proudly attached less than an hour earlier. The woman gathering the orange cones moved across my driveway without saying a word. Even the third member quietly folded the temporary sign reading property under HOA enforcement and placed it inside the back of the white SUV. None of them looked at the neighbors anymore. They kept their eyes on the ground, avoiding the cameras that had suddenly become much more interesting than they had been earlier that morning. Daniel remained where he was, allowing them to finish without interruption. He was not there to create a spectacle. He was there to make certain the situation returned to where it should have been before anyone arrived. As the last cone disappeared into the SUV, Mrs. Keller slowly walked over to me. "Ethan," she said softly, "I owe you an apology." I believed them the moment I saw the uniforms. I smiled. Most people would have. She shook her head. "I should have asked questions before making assumptions." "We all do that sometimes," I replied. "The important part is asking them before it is too late." Mr. Dawson joined us and looked toward Daniel. "I have lived here for almost 15 years, he said. "I have never seen anything like this." Daniel nodded politely. "Unfortunately, appearances can sometimes convince people more quickly than documentation. That is why verification matters." Those words seemed to settle over everyone standing there. Several neighbors quietly looked at the notices that had been removed from my fence. Others compared photographs they had taken earlier, suddenly noticing details they had completely overlooked when the situation first began. Someone pointed out the incorrect seal on the paperwork. Another noticed that the so-called enforcement badges did not match any county identification format. The clues had always been there. They simply had not seemed important until the truth gave them meaning. Brenda finally approached Daniel with noticeably less confidence than before. "We were told this property belonged to an active association," she said. Daniel answered respectfully. "Then whoever provided that information should have verified it before sending anyone here." She lowered her eyes for a moment. Clearly, mistakes were made. Daniel nodded once. "The appropriate course now is to avoid representing authority that has not been confirmed and to ensure any future activities are supported by accurate records." There was no lecture, no dramatic confrontation, just practical guidance based on documented facts. Brenda looked toward me for the first time without the certainty she had carried all morning. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I regret the misunderstanding." I answered honestly. "I appreciate hearing that. I only wish the questions had been asked before your team entered private property." She quietly acknowledged the point with a slight nod. Her team finished loading the last cone into the SUV. The bright yellow vests that had seemed so impressive earlier now looked like ordinary pieces of fabric without the illusion of authority supporting them. As they prepared to leave, Tom Richards raised one final question. "How can homeowners know something like this is legitimate next time?" Daniel answered before anyone else could. "Ask for the registered legal name of the organization. Verify it through public records if necessary. Legitimate representatives should never object to reasonable verification." Several neighbors nodded, some taking notes on their phones. What had begun as an uncomfortable confrontation had quietly become an unexpected lesson for the entire community. The white SUV started its engine and slowly backed toward the road. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. The neighbors simply watched as the vehicle disappeared beyond the entrance to my property. The flashing amber lights that had looked so official when they arrived faded into the distance until they were no longer visible. The yard suddenly felt peaceful again. The breeze moved gently through the trees, and the familiar sound of birds returned as though they had been waiting for the commotion to end. I looked down at the section of fence where the warning notice had been hanging only minutes earlier. The wood was still marked by the small plastic zip tie they had used to attach it. It was a tiny reminder that false authority often leaves behind small scars even after the truth restores order. I reached into my pocket, removed a small pair of wire cutters from my tool pouch, and carefully clipped away the remaining piece of plastic. Sometimes restoring peace begins with something as simple as removing what never belonged there in the first place. The neighborhood slowly returned to its normal rhythm after the white SUV disappeared around the bend, but something had changed in a way that could not be measured with property lines or county maps. The conversations that continued across front yards and mailboxes were no longer about supposed violations or imagined authority. They were about verification, patience, and the importance of asking simple questions before accepting impressive appearances. Daniel Foster closed the folder containing the county records and walked over to shake my hand. "Thank you for staying calm today," he said. "Situations like this often become much more complicated when emotions take over." I smiled and returned the handshake. I figured the truth already had everything it needed. It just needed enough time to arrive. He nodded. That is usually how these situations end. Before leaving, Daniel handed me a business card along with a printed reference sheet explaining how property owners could verify official organizations, recorded easements, and county registration information. "Feel free to share these with your neighbors," he said. "A well-informed community is much harder to mislead." After he drove away, several neighbors stayed behind instead of returning home immediately. Mrs. Keller offered to help remove the last traces of the temporary inspection from my driveway. Tom Richards asked if I would show him where to access county property records online, because he admitted he had never checked them before. Mr. Dawson laughed quietly and said, "I guess matching uniforms and a clipboard fooled all of us for a while." "Not forever," I answered. "Only until someone asked the right question." Over the next week, something unexpected happened. The community organized an informal gathering at the neighborhood pavilion, not because anyone wanted to relive the incident, but because people genuinely wanted to learn how to protect themselves from similar situations. Daniel accepted an invitation to attend during his lunch break and explained the difference between private organizations, voluntary neighborhood groups, county offices, and legally recognized authority. He showed everyone how public records could be searched, why official identification should never be considered an insult when requested respectfully, and how legitimate representatives understood the value of transparency instead of avoiding it. The meeting lasted less than an hour, yet it probably prevented countless misunderstandings in the future. Mrs. Keller later admitted she had already shared the verification guide with her sister in another county. Tom created a neighborhood email group dedicated to sharing official public information instead of rumors. Even the local hardware store placed a small notice near the community bulletin board reminding residents where county property records could be accessed. A single confusing morning had quietly become a lesson that strengthened an entire community. As for my property, life settled back into the peaceful routine I had always enjoyed. I finished repairing the final section of my split-rail fence, replaced the plastic tie marks with fresh wood stain, and planted 2 young maple trees near the entrance where the white SUV had first stopped. Every time I watered those trees, I remembered how quickly appearances can grow and how much longer real trust takes to build. Months later, while organizing paperwork inside my home office, I found one of the laminated notices that had accidentally been left behind after the fake inspection. I studied it for a moment before placing it inside a folder labeled Lessons Learned. Not because I wanted to remember the frustration, but because I wanted to remember the response. Remaining calm had protected my property. Documentation had protected my rights. Patience had protected my reputation. Anger would have accomplished none of those things. Looking back now, I realized the most important moment of that entire day was not when the county records proved I was right or when the fake patrol finally drove away. It happened much earlier, when I chose not to argue louder than they did. I chose to let evidence speak before emotion. That decision changed everything that followed. If there is one lesson my property taught me that morning, it is this. Real authority never fears honest questions. Genuine leadership never depends on intimidation, and lasting justice rarely arrives with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. It arrives quietly through facts, integrity, and people willing to verify the truth before passing judgment. The fence still stands where I built it, the birds still return every spring, and the gravel driveway sounds exactly the same whenever visitors arrive. The only difference is that now, every time I hear tires approaching my gate, I smile a little sooner because I know something that no uniform, no clipboard, and no borrowed title can ever change. Land can be protected by deeds, homes can be protected by locks, but communities are protected by informed neighbors who refuse to mistake confidence for credibility. That morning ended exactly the way it should have, not with revenge, not with humiliation, but with truth restoring trust one fact at a time, proving once again that justice is never the loudest voice in the neighborhood. It is simply the one that remains standing after every question has been answered.